I'm Phil Charles, retired professor of astronomy from the University of Southampton. Perhaps more significantly for this recording now, I was the director of the South African Astronomical Observatory in the noughties from 2004 for 7 years. And so it was during that time that I became very heavily involved with the OAD, in particular with its origins, now more than 15 years ago. So in fact, thinking about the development of the OAD itself, I traced that back to my coming to Cape Town in 2004 when I became director. And in particular, I was going there for the completion and commissioning of SALT, the Southern African Large Telescope. Still the largest single telescope in the Southern Hemisphere, and now a very powerful facility. Now, SALT was groundbreaking, and many people wondered how on earth South Africa could afford such a facility. Well, of course, it was international. Half of it was funded by South Africa, and the other half by a group of international partners, one of whom is the UK, which is where obviously I came from. Now, one of the conditions of South Africa providing the funding was that SALT had to have what was called a collateral benefits program. That is, this telescope obviously would be fantastic for the astronomy community, but it had to be more than that. It had to be special for the people of South Africa, and in particular to help inspire young people and children into education, in particular science education, because astronomy is such a wonderful tool for getting people, particularly young people, interested in science. So that's why we had the SCBP, the SALT Collateral Benefits Program, and we had a very good person running it in Clifford Kamani, but I'd only been there a year, and we were just about to inaugurate SALT when Clifford was given an offer he couldn't refuse, a significant promotion, and he left us, and we had to find someone to replace Clifford. That someone, of course, was Kevin Govender. And that is when I first met Kevin and got to know him extremely well. Now, his background was in physics, but he'd always been inspired by astronomy, and he was fantastic at organizing public outreach events and education. So he came in literally as we had this amazing event to launch SALT, the inauguration up in Sutherland in the Northern Cape. That was a huge success. And from that moment on, SALT really developed a huge public profile in South Africa. I've worked on observatories all over the world, and I'll tell you, the South African public is more aware of their big telescope, SALT, and what's happened since, than almost any other country that has these large telescopes. And that interest helped the Collateral Benefits Program grow under Kevin's direction over the following years. It was influencing immediately education in Sutherland, this tiny Northern Cape town, and it's had a huge impact on contributing to science and maths education there, and it's grown that throughout throughout South Africa. Now, in fact, it was Kevin who led the astronomy for the developing world, developing astronomy globally. And about 2 years after that, we were preparing for the event which, in my mind, signaled the start of the OAD. But what happened was that the International Astronomical Union was preparing for 2009. But 2009 was significant to astronomers because it was the 400th anniversary of Galileo's first use of the telescope to study the skies, which had spectacular scientific consequences. In fact, we measure that date, 1609, as the date that modern observational astronomy began. The IAU wanted 2009 to be declared the International Year of Astronomy. And in fact, Kevin was involved in the IAU's efforts to get the United Nations to make such a declaration, which they did, reaching a huge global audience. Here we were in 2008 preparing for this International Year of Astronomy, and we decided to have a star party at the very end of the year on December 31st, so that we would be right there with a large public event in Sutherland on the 1st of January. And we did something that we'd never done with the telescopes at Sutherland before. We threw all of them open to the general public for that New Year's Eve. And it was extremely successful. Kevin and the Salt Collateral Benefits Program played a major role in this. And we had a wonderful event. So I was amazed how many people had come up there. Sutherland, this tiny little town in the Karoo, is since the opening of SALT is now getting something like 15,000 regular visitors a year. It's got a fantastic visitor center that Kevin and his team have helped build over this time. It's been that has been extremely successful. And just 3 weeks into 2009, we had a solar eclipse. And we managed to get the Minister of Science and Technology, Naledi Pandor, to come into the observatory in Cape Town. And we called that the official launch in South Africa of the International Year of Astronomy. So that was televised, speeches, and that we actually had good weather. It wasn't a total solar eclipse. It was a partial one, still a very respectable eclipse. And I remember it for the fact that in one of the trees outside the old observatory building was the leaves. This is in, of course, late summer, so they were dried and cracked, and they were letting shafts of light come through, and the small cracks, of course, were projecting images, shadows of the sun partially eclipsed, and you could see dozens of tiny images of the partially eclipsed sun on the ground and on the building. One of our technicians took a photograph of that, and that became the astronomy picture of the day. I thought that was a wonderful way of celebrating the day and showing what was going on in South Africa. Now, this began then this year, and that's where, for me, the activities of our collateral benefits program actually moved up to a completely different level. And I was delighted and impressed with the scale of not just in South Africa, but across Africa. I remember one meeting that Kevin was organizing. He had a lot of people present from within South Africa, and he was simultaneously involving on a Skype call people from half a dozen different African countries, finding lots of volunteers to get the story of the International Year and astronomy out to communities that never been exposed to this before. So during that time, I became aware that this was really part of ideas that the then president of the IAU, Bob Williams, and his colleagues like George Mylan had been coming up with the idea. We wanted all this fabulous momentum from the IYA shouldn't finish at the end of 2009, but should carry on in a really significant program, which they called Astronomy for the Developing World. Because we know that astronomy is a fantastic way of getting people interested in science, but we need to find a way of having this work for society as a whole and our culture. And so they developed this program, Astronomy for the Developing World, out of which they decided that there needed to be an office of astronomy for development, which is what we're talking about today, the OAD. And they put together this concept and asked for people to bid to host the OAD. Now that's when I realized that South Africa had a fantastic chance to go for this. But we had SALT working extremely well to highlight what was happening in South Africa. And I was realizing how important it was for science education in the country. Africa is the region as a whole where the education levels are at the lowest in the world. And that has to change. And astronomy is a brilliant way of inspiring children into science education and also helping to give teachers at schools the resources that they need to teach all this material. And so I could see that South Africa would be very strongly placed to bid for this. And when the opportunity came out would have been in 2010, so just over 10 years ago, I was really keen, as was my close colleague at SAEO, Patricia Whitelock, who also played a significant role with the IAU. We supported Kevin very strongly in bidding for SAEO to host the OAD. And not only did we succeed in that, the next step was we supported Kevin in his bid to become its first director, which of course he was successful. What has particularly inspired me about the OAD in its first 10 years is that it really has shown that, what astronomy can do if taken out to the people in the way that the OAD has been doing, what it can achieve. I've seen an enormous change in that in my lifetime in astronomy now, almost 50 years. The popularity has already been there, and there's always been a public interest. But in South Africa, I saw what a difference it was able to make. And Kevin's work with the Collateral Benefits Program and then with the OAD showed that how education and outreach are actually integral to scientific development and bringing on the community. Now, we're inspiring young people into science. Now, people often say to me, well, what good is learning about astronomy? And I always say, astronomy is applied physics and mathematics. It's a brilliant way of inspiring people into science. I don't want to create 10,000 astronomers. I want to create 10,000 scientists. Remember, modern astronomy is not just mathematics and physics. Of course, it includes the advanced technologies of optics, photonic detectors that are required for these telescopes to actually work. This is cutting edge engineering. Not to mention, then working with the data that it produces requires cutting edge computing facilities and programming tools. But to study the universe doesn't just require physics. Interstellar molecules requires a knowledge of chemistry. And the most rapidly growing new field of astronomy is biophysics. And that's because of the discovery now of more than 2,000 exosolar planets. We're still looking for Earth-like ones, but we found a huge range of planets with extraordinary range of conditions where the biochemistry of the atmospheres of these planets is a fantastic new field of study. So that brings in all these different aspects of science. If you study this, you can go and do anything after this. And it also can fit into the culture of different societies who are always fascinated and inspired by this kind of material. So this Office of Astronomy for Development was the IAU's first foray into creating a unit like this, and they it was a brilliant choice to put it in South Africa because it's important for the African continent. But they are expanding this to having other offices, such as the IAU Office of Astronomy for Education in particular. So it really has set a fantastic standard. Now, what I've been particularly impressed with in its first decade is just to see the scale of now the global activity. Because remember, this is the Office for Global Astronomy Development. And Kevin's team have set up 11 regional offices around the world. They're running something like 160 projects. It's a remarkably small team, with a large number of volunteers around the world. So this is, I think, a fantastic achievement, which has already caused the United Nations to take note, and to have science for development is one of their own strategic development goals. So that is a fantastic way of measuring the success of the OAD project here, to see what influence it has had on the entire world. My proudest moment in terms of my association with the OAD was 5 years ago, when the Edinburgh Science Festival 2016 awarded Kevin the Edinburgh Medal, or awarded Kevin and the IAU the medal in recognition of the creation of the OAD and its first 5 years of operation. and of the accomplishments that they had had then, which have gone substantially beyond that now. I thought that was a perfect recognition of the huge amount of effort that Kevin and his team had put into the OAD, which that is one of my most positive memories of my time associated with South Africa. Where is it going? And because we're now entering its second decade, and the world has significant challenges. Now, one of them, and it's really becoming quite apparent to us in different parts of the world, that is, how do you bring the message of astronomy and what we teach in education in schools in astronomy in countries with very strict religious doctrines, where the children are taught the exact opposite of what we present as part of general science education. One is tempted to quote here from Carl Sagan of the need to overcome fanatic, ethnic, religious, and national identities if we are to tackle important global issues. Now, Carl Sagan is sadly no longer with us, but I think he would be shocked to see the scale of the problems we are facing around the world with the current COVID-19 pandemic and the difficulty in having people accepting vaccinations, which of course is crucial if we're going to overcome it, and the scale of global warming that we have reached, and the now absolutely clear recognition of climate change as evidenced by the very latest IPCC report and the problems that we face. Those problems need addressing by people who have been exposed to basic levels of science education to understand these problems. Astronomy is a fantastic way of getting these basic ideas of science across to so many people. That is going to be a fantastic challenge. And the next big event in the coming decade, I feel, is going to be the IAU's triennial General Assembly in 2024 is going to be in Cape Town. This will be the first General Assembly in the continent of Africa. The IAU began in the 1920s, just over 100 years ago. And so it is going to be fantastic to have the IAU-GA in Cape Town. And I'm sure that the OAD is going to play a significant role in helping make that a truly inspirational event. In this fantastic future for astronomy in the 21st century, this next decade is going to see the final commissioning of some of the most spectacular astronomical facilities we've ever had access to. I've mentioned Meerkat moving to the square kilometer array, the construction of which is just starting. And we've got the James Webb Space Telescope due for launch later this year, which will be a 6.5 meter telescope in space. We're just completing the construction of the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope in Chile, which has been renamed the Vera Rubin Observatory, which will produce a survey of the sky, survey of the sky on the most extraordinary depth and scale. In particular, it will do it every 4 or 5 nights. This will be a survey not just of where things are, but how they vary. Time domain. And, plus a number of other space-based facilities that will be coming along at X-ray and then UV wavelengths. So these will be superb facilities, and they will be open to astronomers from all over the world. Now, particularly, I want to mention the SKA, because this array, although it starts in the Northern Cape of South Africa, it will have dishes going across almost a dozen Southern African countries. And this is where the OAD, the concept of generating interest in young people and in children in astronomy, because that's how they get their science education. We have a superb example here of bringing astronomy science education to the countries which are hosting the SKA dishes in Africa. They don't have the teachers, they don't have the facilities, but this is where the activities of astronomy for development really come into their own, because they see these things coming into their own countries and they want to know about them. And this will generate the young people who will become the astronomers and scientists of the future, because they will then be able to get access to the data from these facilities, and that the World Wide Web, the internet, makes that access possible. They need to know what to do with it and what it means. And this is where education and outreach absolutely comes into its own. And this is true across the entire world in terms of getting absolutely the most out of all these superb facilities.